My name is Salma Porter, 32 years old, and I'm a sergeant in the United States Army. But the greatest shock of my life didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened right at my own family's dinner table. You are a selfish bitch! My sister screamed right before she threw a glass of ice water in my face. The cold shock soaked through my uniform, but what really stopped my heart were the words my mother said next. She didn't look at Tiffany. She looked at me, sighed with annoyance, and said, "Salma, you always make such a big deal out of everything. It's just a little water." All because I refused to give her my entire life savings, $35,000, to pay off her gambling debts. They had no idea that my mother's words, that cruel dismissal of my pain, was the final order that launched me into a campaign they would never forget. If you've ever felt like your sacrifices were treated like garbage by the very people you made them for, let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit that subscribe button. This war is for all of us. I parked my Ford F-150 in front of the small single-story ranch house in Arvada I'd grown up in. For a moment, I sat with the engine ticking, letting the familiar scent wash over me. It was the rich, savory aroma of my mother's pot roast, slow-cooked from my grandmother's recipe. It was a smell reserved for special occasions, a scent that was supposed to mean welcome home. You are safe here. I took a deep breath, trying to force a feeling of hope into my lungs, but it caught in my throat. This wasn't a celebration, it was a summons. The moment I stepped through the front door, that comforting illusion shattered. The air inside wasn't warm. It was thick with a tension so dense you could almost taste it. This was the specific atmosphere of a family bracing for impact. My sister, Tiffany, was already seated at the head of the oak dining table, a position she'd always claimed. Her acrylic nails, a garish shade of pink, tapped an impatient rhythm against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was the only sound in the room, a relentless beat that sounded like a countdown timer. My mother, Deborah, was a blur of motion in the kitchen, moving with a fake hustle, arranging things that were already in place. She polished an already gleaming spoon, shifted the salt and pepper shakers a quarter inch, all while avoiding my eyes, avoiding Tiffany's eyes, avoiding the conflict brewing in her home. She brought a bowl of mashed potatoes to the table, then a dish of buttered green beans, chattering about the unseasonably warm weather in a strained, cheerful voice. It was a cheap piece, a flimsy ceasefire before a battle I knew was inevitable. I just didn't know when the first shot would be fired. We hadn't even finished our first bites. Tiffany's fork clattered against her plate, a sharp, jarring sound. "Let's just cut the crap about the weather," she said, her voice dripping with challenge. "Selma, you know why you're here." Her eyes locked onto mine across the table, hard and demanding. She launched into a poorly constructed lie about a last-chance business opportunity, a pathetic disguise for her latest gambling losses from the casinos up in Black Hawk. Then came the number, dropped onto the table with the weight of an anchor. $35,000. I carefully placed my own fork down, lining it up perfectly beside my plate. I needed that small, precise act of control. "That's my deployment money," I replied, my voice as steady as a drill command. It was the money I'd earned in the dust and heat of Afghanistan, the money I'd set aside for a down payment on a small place of my own, a place of peace. It's my future. I can't. Tiffany let out a bitter laugh, sharp as cracking ice. "Afghanistan again," she sneered, her lips curling. "You always use the army to act so high and mighty. You think you're better than us. The truth is, you're just selfish, Salma." My calm refusal was all the trigger she needed. "You are a selfish bitch," she roared, the sudden violence in her voice making me flinch. Pure, ugly rage twisted her features into a mask I barely recognized. The tall glass of iced lemonade on the table became her weapon. I saw it happen in horrifying slow motion. Her hand snatching the glass, the arc it made through the air between us. Then, the impact. The biting cold shocked my skin, the sharp edges of the ice cubes stinging my cheek and jaw before clattering onto my plate. The sticky liquid ran in cold streams down my neck, soaking the front of my Army service uniform, drenching the fabric right over the embroidered name tape that read, Porter. I didn't feel the cold. I felt exposed, violated, stripped bare in the one place I was supposed to be safe. She hadn't just thrown water at me. She had spit on every part of me that mattered. She had desecrated 10 years of service, of discipline, of sleepless nights. She had dishonored the memory of every soldier I'd ever served with, every friend who never made it home. My uniform, a symbol of my honor, was now stained because of my family's greed. The world seemed to stop. The only sound was Tiffany's heavy, triumphant breathing. My eyes shot to my mother. It was a reflex, a child's instinct. I was looking for my commander, my ally, the one person who was supposed to restore order. But Deborah didn't even look at Tiffany. She looked straight at me. Her eyes held no sympathy, no shock, no protective anger. There was only a profound weariness, a deep annoyance, as if I were the source of this disruption, as if my pain was an inconvenience. Then she fired the shot that killed the last shred of hope in my heart. "Salma, you always make such a big deal out of everything," she said, her voice flat and dismissive. "It's just a little water." Every word was a bullet, hitting me with physical force. They pierced the armor I'd so carefully built. She wasn't just excusing Tiffany, she was invalidating my reality, siding with the attacker and painting me as the one who was out of line. In that cold, clear moment of ultimate betrayal, I finally understood. I didn't have a family. I didn't have a home. I just had two people I shared blood with. Two people who saw me not as a daughter or a sister, but as a resource to be drained. Slowly, I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the hardwood floor, a harsh, grating sound that filled the dead silence. Without a single word, without another glance in their direction, I turned my back on the wreckage of my childhood and walked out the door, letting it click shut behind me with a quiet finality. I drove south on US 85, heading toward Colorado Springs. The night outside my windows was as black and suffocating as the feeling in my chest. The radio was silent. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the only anchor in a sea of swirling darkness. Each time my truck passed under the sterile, blue-white glare of a highway light, it illuminated another ghost from the past, another memory rising up to haunt me. My mother had been right about one thing tonight. I don't make a big deal out of things. I swallow them, I bury them. For years, I'd been burying my pain so deep, I'd almost convinced myself it wasn't there. But now, the dam had broken. The damp, sticky patch on my uniform was no longer lemonade. It was the physical manifestation of every tear I'd refused to let myself cry. It was a cold, wet stain of grief. Even this truck, my Ford F-150, was a ghost. I'd bought it with my re-enlistment bonus, the first truly substantial thing I had ever owned. I remembered the pride I felt driving it off the lot. A week later, Tiffany called. She'd run into some trouble and needed $500. I'd lent it to her without a second thought. I see now that every achievement, every milestone in my life had been systematically drained from the very beginning. A sharp, painful memory cut through the hum of the tires on the asphalt. I was 19, fresh from my first deployment. I was so proud, so full of a sense of purpose. My battalion commander had presented me with a challenge coin for courage during a particularly rough engagement. It wasn't made of gold or silver, its value wasn't monetary. But to me, it was everything. It was a heavy bronze token of respect, a symbol that I belonged to a brotherhood, that my sacrifice had meant something. I kept it in a small wooden box on my dresser, a private monument to the person I was becoming. A few months later, I noticed it was gone. I tore my room apart, a frantic panic rising in my throat. When I finally cornered Tiffany, she tried to lie, but her eyes gave her away. She admitted she'd taken it and pawned it. For $20. "It's just a piece of metal, Salma," she'd said with an indifferent shrug. But the real betrayal came from my mother. When I told her, my voice shaking with a sense of violation, she hadn't shared my outrage. She had sighed, that same weary sigh I heard tonight. "Just let it go," she'd said, not even looking up from her magazine. "Your sister was just desperate. You'll have a lifetime to earn things like that." She didn't understand. It wasn't a thing. It was my honor, and she had just told me that my honor was worth less than my sister's desperation. Another ghost flickered into view under another highway lamp. This one was older, deeper. My grandfather had left me his stamp collection. It was his life's passion, bound in heavy leather albums, full of tiny, colorful paper squares from all over the world. He'd spent hours with me, telling me the stories behind each one. It was the most precious thing I owned. When I was 21, Tiffany announced she was going to rehab. She cried, swore she was ready to change, but the program was expensive. My parents sat me down. They talked about second chances, about family sticking together. So I sold the collection. I took the albums to a dealer and watched as he valued a lifetime of my grandfather's love in dollars and cents. I gave every last penny to Tiffany. 6 months later, I found a photo album she'd left at the house. Tucked in the back were pictures of her and her boyfriend, laughing, drinking cocktails by a glittering pool. The pictures were dated from the week she was supposedly in rehab. The location stamp said, Las Vegas, Nevada. My hands tightened on the wheel. The highway stretched on, an endless ribbon of asphalt and memory. The final ghost was the one that hurt the most, because it wasn't just my honor or my inheritance that was stolen. It was my future. My senior year of high school, I was selected for a prestigious youth internship program in Washington, D.C. It was my dream. I'd worked for months at a local sandwich shop, the smell of toasted bread and deli meat clinging to my clothes, saving every dollar. I had exactly $500, just enough for the trip. A week before I was supposed to leave, Tiffany got into a minor fender bender. She needed $500 to fix her bumper without telling the insurance. My parents called a family meeting. My father, a man who rarely raised his voice, explained that the family's reputation was at stake. They pressured me, reasoned with me, guilted me until I felt suffocated. "You can go to D.C. another time," my father had said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Family comes first." So I stayed home. I lay in my bed and cried quietly while my friends posted pictures of themselves standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. That was the day I learned that in my family, family comes first was just code for Tiffany comes first. If you've ever had to give up a piece of your own dream to fix someone else's mistake, hit that like button to show some support. And if you know what it feels like to have your sacrifices go completely unseen, just comment with the word, "I see you," below. As the distant lights of Colorado Springs finally appeared on the horizon, something inside me began to shift. The crushing sadness didn't disappear, but it began to harden, to crystallize into something else. Cold, sharp clarity. For my entire life, I hadn't been a daughter or a sister. I had been a function. I was the family bank, the crisis repair center, the designated grown-up. They didn't love me, they used me. My stability was the safety net that allowed for their chaos. My mother's words tonight weren't a lapse in judgment. They were a mission statement. How long have I let this go on? I parked in a visitor spot outside Gregory Lane's apartment complex in Old Colorado City. He was the only person I could think of, the only name that surfaced from the wreckage in my mind. Greg and I had met during a joint training exercise years ago, and our friendship was forged in the quiet understanding that only exists between soldiers. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect, not messy family obligation. He was my safe house. It was late when I knocked on his door, the sound echoing in the silent hallway. When he opened it, his face was groggy with sleep, but it snapped into sharp concern the second he saw me. He didn't need an explanation. His eyes took in the whole scene in a single, practiced sweep. The damp-stained uniform, the hollowed-out look in my eyes, the way I stood shivering despite the mild night air. Without a word, he stepped aside and pulled me into the warmth of his apartment. While I stood numbly in his living room, he moved with a quiet efficiency. He put a kettle on the stove, pulled a mug from the cabinet, and then disappeared into his bedroom. He returned with a soft, gray t-shirt and held it out to me. It had an Air Force logo on the chest. "Go change," he said gently. "I'll make some tea." That simple act of kindness, of respecting the uniform he knew I cherished by wanting me out of the one that had been desecrated, was almost enough to make me break down completely. He handed me a steaming mug of chamomile tea, and its warmth seeped into my frozen fingers. I sank into the worn leather of his sofa, the first moment of safety I'd felt all night. He sat in the armchair opposite me, not crowding me, just giving me his full attention. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me it would be okay. He just waited. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was the calm, steady anchor I desperately needed. "Report, Sergeant." And so I did. The story came pouring out of me, a raw, uncensored field report of the evening's ambush. But it didn't stop there. I reported on the years of smaller skirmishes, the decades of rescuing Tiffany from her self-made disasters, my mother's endless excuses, my father's complicit silence. I laid out the whole ugly history of my one-woman war. Greg listened. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded in all the right places, his expression growing harder with every detail. When I got to the part about the thrown glass and my mother's final, dismissive words, his jaw tightened and he clenched his fists. "That wasn't a failure of command, Salma," he said, his voice low and firm. "That was an act of complicity." Hearing him say it, hearing him name the crime so clearly, was like a release valve on a pressure cooker. For the first time, someone had validated my reality. He gave me permission to feel the rage I'd been suppressing, to acknowledge the full depth of the betrayal. He stood up, pacing the small living room with the restless energy of a lawyer dissecting a case. "Salma," he said, stopping to look at me. "In the Army, we have rules of engagement. They exist to make sure we act with clarity and purpose. They force you to identify legitimate targets and to understand what constitutes acceptable collateral damage." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You need to apply that to your life. Right now." He resumed pacing. "Something's bothering me. That number, $35,000, it's too specific. She didn't just pull that out of thin air. Something's not right here." He reminded me of something I'd mentioned to him months ago and had completely dismissed. A strange call from a debt collection agency, asking for me by name, about an account I didn't recognize. I'd assumed it was a simple mistake, a scam call. "Maybe it wasn't a mistake," Greg said, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Maybe it was a probing attack you didn't notice." A chill, colder and sharper than the ice water, shot down my spine. Greg, with his trained legal mind, saw a tactical threat where I had only seen emotional chaos. He saw a pattern where I had only seen pain. "You need to check your credit report," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Right now." We opened his laptop on the coffee table. His fingers flew across the keyboard, guiding me to the Equifax website. I typed in my information, my hands trembling slightly as I hit Enter. As the report loaded and the page refreshed, we both fell silent. There it was. An American Express card opened 6 months ago in my name. The credit limit was $15,000. The billing address was a run-down apartment in Aurora that Tiffany had rented 2 years ago. My eyes scanned the list of transactions, and the sick feeling in my stomach intensified. Cash withdrawals at casino ATMs, payments to online betting sites, charges from expensive restaurants I had never been to. She wasn't just asking me for money. She had been stealing from me for months. She had stolen my name, my identity, my good credit that I had worked so hard to build. This wasn't just family dysfunction anymore. This was a crime, a felony. The betrayal was deeper, more calculated, and more sinister than I could have ever imagined. "Greg," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "This is war." He came and sat on the edge of the sofa, placing a firm, steadying hand on my shoulder. His presence was a solid wall at my back. "Yes, it is," he said, his voice cold with a shared fury. "And now, we draft the plan of attack." The initial shock of discovery, that raw, gut punch of betrayal, lasted only a moment. Then something else took over. A cold, quiet calm settled over me, the kind of hyper-focused clarity I'd only ever felt in the field. The emotional storm receded, and in its place was the mission. An instructor in Intel school once drilled a lesson into us. Never act on assumptions. Act only on verified intelligence. That voice was in my head now. My new commanding officer. Gregory's apartment became our tactical operations center. We cleared the coffee table of magazines and coasters, replacing them with his laptop, a portable printer, and stacks of clean white paper. We didn't sleep that night. Fueled by black coffee, Greg drew up a list of intelligence targets on a legal pad. My bank statements for the last 12 months, credit reports from all three major bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, and a complete history of my text messages with Tiffany. We need to build an undeniable timeline, he said, his voice low and focused. Every lie she told you, every request for money, has to be cross-referenced with a financial transaction. We leave no room for doubt. I nodded, the broken-hearted daughter already fading, replaced by the sergeant. This was no longer a family drama. This was an intelligence-gathering operation, and I would execute it with absolute precision. The next morning, the campaign began. The first calls were to my bank and the fraud departments of the credit card companies. I spent hours on hold, listening to terrible synthesized music, navigating automated phone trees, and repeating my story to a dozen different agents. Each call was its own small battle, demanding a reserve of patience I didn't know I had. I was calm, polite, but firm. I was a soldier on a mission. As the first encrypted emails containing the PDF statements began to arrive, I printed them out. Page after page, I went through the transactions, a bright yellow highlighter in my hand. With each swipe of the marker, the picture of Tiffany's secret life became clearer, and it was uglier than I could have imagined. It wasn't just one fraudulent credit card. It was 3, and a personal loan, all in my name. She hadn't just been bleeding me dry with her constant requests for cash. She had built an entire empire of debt on the foundation of my identity. The next phase of the operation was to analyze the existing intel, my text message history with Tiffany. Reading the old messages now was like looking at them with a black light, revealing the hidden stains of manipulation. One text from 4 months ago stood out. Salma, I swear this is the last time. I just need $2,000 to get clear. I'll pay you back next month. I remembered the knot in my stomach as I'd made the transfer, the feeling of being an endless ATM. I pulled up the bank statement for that same week. 2 days after my money hit her account, there was a charge on one of the fraudulent credit cards. A $2,000 payment to a casino resort in Cripple Creek. Her desperate pleas for help weren't cries for a lifeline. They were tactical diversions designed to keep my attention focused on one front while she was launching a full-scale attack on another I never even knew existed. The most sickening discovery came from a credit card statement dated 2 months prior. It was the week of our mother's birthday. I remembered Tiffany calling me, crying because she was broke and couldn't afford to get Mom a gift. I had felt a pang of pity. I'd sent her $100. On the statement, nestled between cash withdrawals and online payments, was a charge for $800 from a high-end jewelry store at the Cherry Creek Mall. I knew that store. And I knew the diamond necklace my mother had been wearing for the past 2 months, the one she said Tiffany had given her. A gift so surprisingly thoughtful, it had brought her to tears. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it left me breathless. She had used my stolen identity to buy our mother a lavish gift, cementing her status as the thoughtful daughter while simultaneously making me feel guilty and inadequate. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. I took screenshots of every damning text message. Methodically, I printed them and laid them out on the coffee table next to the corresponding bank statements. Each pair of documents was a self-contained proof of a cold, calculated betrayal. By the end of the second day, the coffee table was no longer a piece of furniture. It was a wall of evidence, a mosaic of deceit. A thick binder now sat in the center of it all, filled with neatly organized tabs. Fraudulent credit cards, illegal personal loans, evidence of text, message manipulation. I stared at the binder, not with horror or with sadness, but with a feeling of cold, hard power. This was no longer my word against hers. This wasn't about feelings or perceptions. This was the truth. documented in black ink and irrefutable numbers. This was my arsenal. Gregory reviewed the completed file, flipping through the plastic-sleeved pages with a satisfied nod. He looked up at me, his eyes serious. "Good," he said. "Now you're ready for the confrontation. Phase 1 is complete." After 2 days immersed in the toxic details of my sister's betrayal, I needed to breathe. Gregory had gone to his office, and the apartment, once a safe house, now felt like a command bunker filled with the ghosts of battles to come. I needed space. I needed perspective. I drove to the Garden of the Gods, a place so ancient and immense it has a way of putting human problems in their proper scale. I found a secluded spot, climbing onto a massive red sandstone rock warmed by the gentle Colorado sun. All around me, jagged fins of rock soared into a painfully blue sky, silent monuments that had stood for millions of years. They had witnessed the rise and fall of mountains, the passing of ice ages. They would stand long after the name Porter was forgotten. The thought should have been comforting. I put in my earbuds, not for music, but for reinforcement. I started a podcast by Brené Brown. She was talking about the courage of setting boundaries, about the messy, uncomfortable work of choosing integrity over comfort. Her voice was a calm, steady presence in my ear. "Clear is kind," she said. "Unclear is unkind." The words resonated deep in my bones. It was a new kind of mission statement, a rule of engagement for the war I was now fighting. For a few precious moments, sitting there in the sun, surrounded by silent stone giants, I felt a flicker of peace. And then, my phone vibrated against the rock beside me. The screen lit up with a single word. "Mom." I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the fragile piece shatter into 1,000 pieces. The air suddenly felt colder. I knew this wasn't a wellness check. It was a counteroffensive. I swiped to answer. "Salma, honey," my mother's voice chirped, sickeningly sweet. "I was just calling to see if you were okay. I've been so worried about you." It was her classic opening gambit, an initial volley of fake concern designed to soften the target for the real attack to come. The old Salma would have fallen for it, would have melted at the word, honey. The new Salma was on high alert. "I'm fine, Mom," I replied, my voice perfectly even, betraying no emotion. "What's this about?" My directness seemed to throw her off script. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Well," she stammered, recovering. "It's just, you know how Tiffany is. She's just not well right now, Salma. This is when a family needs to pull together, to be strong for each other." She was painting a beautiful Norman Rockwell picture of family unity, a picture I knew was a complete and utter fraud. It was a fantasy she used to cover up the ugly reality. "Mom," I interrupted, the words, clear as kind, echoing in my head. "This isn't a case of not being well. This is a crime." I said the words slowly, deliberately, letting each one land with its full weight. She opened 3 fraudulent credit cards and took out a personal loan in my name. That is identity fraud. It's a felony. I heard her sharp intake of breath. Silence. I had just lobbed a flashbang grenade of pure, undeniable fact into the fog of her denial. And then, the defenses went up. "Oh, don't use such ugly, heavy words," she chided, her tone shifting from sweet to condescending. "I'm sure it's all just a big misunderstanding. Your sister would never—" She couldn't even finish the sentence because we both knew it was a lie. Her voice trailed off, but she quickly found a new line of attack. "I knew she was in a bit of trouble a few weeks ago," she admitted, her voice dropping. "She told me things were tight. I was hoping you could just help her sort it out quietly, like you always do." There it was, the quiet confession of her complicity. She had known. She had known there was a problem, and instead of intervening, instead of being a parent, she had simply waited, expecting me to fall back into my designated role as the family fixer. Her hope wasn't for her daughter's well-being. It was for the problem to go away without disturbing her peace. When facts and reason failed, my mother deployed her ultimate weapon, emotional blackmail. "Salma, you are tearing this family apart," she said, her voice starting to tremble with a carefully manufactured anger. This wasn't the sound of a mother's grief. It was the sound of a queen whose authority had been challenged. After everything your father and I have done for you, this is how you repay us. By threatening to call the police on your own sister? You are breaking my heart. Do you understand that? You're breaking your mother's heart. She was doing it. The classic textbook maneuver, flipping the script, turning the victim into the villain. For years, it had worked every single time. It was a weapon against which I had no defense, but this time it just bounced off. The words hit me, but they didn't penetrate. The person tearing this family apart, I replied, and my voice was as cold and hard as the rocks around me, is the one who committed a felony against her own sister, and the mother who stood by and let it happen. The silence on the other end was absolute. I had refused the burden of her manufactured guilt. I had rejected the role she had assigned me. Her responsibilities, I said, my voice clear and final, are no longer mine. Before she could reply, before she could regroup for another assault, I ended the call. I stared out at the unmoving, majestic landscape, my hand still gripping the phone. I had drawn the line. The counteroffensive had failed. The war had just become real. Gregory and I were hunched over the coffee table, arranging the final pieces of our arsenal. The binder sat in the middle, a thick monument to my sister's deceit. We had a timeline. We had proof. For the first time in days, I felt the solid ground of control beneath my feet. We were in the final stages of planning, and the cold, focused calm of the mission had completely taken over. Then, the mail arrived. The mail carrier dropping the small bundle of letters through the slot in Gregory's front door was an ordinary, everyday sound. But among the bills and junk mail was a plain brown envelope, addressed to me at my parents' house and forwarded from there. The return address was a pawn shop in a suburb on the east side of Denver. My heart began to beat a little faster, a low, nervous drum against my ribs. My hands felt cold as I tore it open. Inside was a single, formally typed page. It was an official notice informing me that an item pawned under my name was approaching its final date for repayment. But it wasn't my name in the signature line of the pawn ticket. The name listed as the seller was Tiffany Porter. My breath caught in my throat. My eyes scanned down the page, searching for the description of the item. And then I saw it. The words seemed to lift off the page, black and venomous. Item description: 1 pair of silver military-issue dog tags, engraved with the name David Porter. My father. They were my father's dog tags. The tags he wore in Vietnam. The tags that had rested against his chest for 20 years of his life. The tags that I had held in my hand at his funeral 5 years ago after the heart attack took him from us. They were the only thing of his I had kept. The only piece of him I had left. The world went silent. The neatly stacked papers on the table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, Gregory's voice, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. Salma? What is it? What's wrong? I couldn't answer. I couldn't form words. My body had gone rigid, my blood turning to ice in my veins. All I could do was raise a trembling hand and point at the paper. In that single, sickening moment, every bit of my calm, my strategic planning, my military discipline, shattered into a million pieces. It didn't just break. It vaporized. All that was left was a raw, primal rage, a white-hot volcanic fury that erupted from the deepest part of my soul. She had dared. After everything, the money, the lies, the fraud, she had dared to touch them. She had dared to put her hands on the one thing in my life that was sacred. I snatched my truck keys from the counter and bolted for the door. Gregory was on his feet, calling after me. Salma, wait! What's the plan? There is no plan, I screamed back, my voice a raw, ragged tear in the quiet afternoon as I pounded down the apartment stairs. This is annihilation. The 45-minute drive from Colorado Springs to Denver passed in a red-tinted blur. I don't remember the traffic. I don't remember the turns. My foot was welded to the accelerator, the truck eating up the miles on I-25. My mind was consumed by a single, repeating, violating image. Tiffany's hands, her grimy, money-grubbing, gambling hands, closing around the cool silver of my father's dog tags. Her taking that sacred memory and trading it for a handful of dirty cash. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I hit the front door with my shoulder, the cheap wood splintering around the lock as it burst inward. Tiffany and my mother were sitting on the sofa in the living room, watching some daytime TV show. They both jumped, their faces masks of shock and fear. "What did you do?" I roared, my voice raw and hoarse, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. I stalked toward them and threw the crumpled letter from the pawn shop onto the coffee table in front of them. "Dad's dog tags," I growled, leaning over the table, my hands braced on the wood. "How much did you get for them, Tiffany? $50? 100? What is the price of our father's memory?" She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, her eyes wide with panic. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you lie to me," I screamed, and the force of my own voice seemed to shake the pictures on the wall. "Your name is right there. You stole them from my room. You sold the last piece of my father I had left on this earth." My mother tried to intervene, her voice a weak, placating murmur. "Salma, honey, calm down." "No." I whipped my head around to face her, and for the first time in my 32 years of life, the only thing I felt when I looked at my mother was pure, undiluted hatred. "You don't say a word. You let this happen. You enabled this monster that you raised in your own house. You are an accomplice." I turned my eyes back to Tiffany. She was cowering now, trying to shrink into the sofa cushions, to disappear. But there was nowhere for her to hide. "It all ends now," I said, and my voice was suddenly no longer hot with rage. It was dead calm. It was cold. It was lethal. "This isn't about the money anymore. This is about honor. I'm not just going to report you to the police. I am going to ruin you. Do you understand me?" I stood up straight, my back rigid. There are some lines that should never be crossed, some things that are sacred. If you believe that, hit the like button for my dad's memory. And in the comments, just write the word honor if you understand why this was the point of no return. "The rescue mission is over," I declared, my voice echoing in the horrified silence of the room. "The punitive campaign begins now." I turned and walked away, leaving them to drown in the ruins they had created. The dam had finally broken, and now the flood was going to wash them all away. I drove back to Gregory's apartment, but the person who walked through his door was not the same one who had stormed out an hour earlier. The explosive, chaotic rage had burned itself out, and what was left in its place was something far more dangerous. A cold, hard, and perfectly clear sense of purpose. I was no longer a soldier in retreat, panicked and disoriented by an ambush. I was a survivor, returning to base with the enemy's exact location, ready to plan the final, overwhelming assault. He was waiting for me, as I knew he would be. The tactical operations center on the coffee table had been cleared and reset. A fresh pot of black coffee was brewing, its strong, dark scent cutting through the air. He didn't ask me what happened, what I had done or said. He didn't need to. He took one long, assessing look at the cold resolve in my eyes and knew the emotional battle was over. The real one was about to begin. "You got it out of your system," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. "Good. Now let's turn that anger into a weapon." He was right. The emotional explosion had been a necessary purge, a violent clearing of the emotional battlefield inside my own head. It had cauterized the wound, leaving behind a clean, hard scar. All the doubt, the fear, the toxic, lingering hope for a family that never truly existed. It was all gone, burned away in the fire of my fury. "I need your help, Greg," I said, and my voice was steady and firm, with none of the trembling it had held just hours before. "Not just as my friend, I'm retaining you as my lawyer." A slow, serious smile spread across Gregory's face. It was a smile of respect, of readiness. He nodded once, a sharp, definitive gesture. "I was waiting for you to say that," he said. "Let's get to work." He rolled a small whiteboard out from a corner of his living room, the wheels squeaking softly on the hardwood floor. With a black dry erase marker, he drew a firm line down the middle, creating 2 columns. "Okay, Sergeant Porter," he began, his tone shifting seamlessly from friend to legal counsel, a former JAG officer preparing his case. Here's our two-pronged plan of attack. He pointed a finger at the first column. Prong 1, the civil assault. We go on the offensive with the financial institutions. We file fraud affidavits with every credit bureau and bank. We freeze every single account she opened in your name, effective immediately. Then, we draft and send Tiffany a formal legal demand letter, laying out every single debt in excruciating detail, demanding full and immediate restitution. The objective here, he explained, is to contain the financial damage, scrub your record clean, and recover every last cent she stole from you. He paused, letting the weight of the plan sink in, then tapped the second column with the marker. Prong 2, the criminal deterrent. We will compile our entire dossier, every statement, every text, every piece of evidence, into a complete, undeniable package for the district attorney's office. He turned from the board and looked me straight in the eye, his voice low and serious. Identity theft over $20,000 is a Class 3 felony in the state of Colorado, Salma. That carries a presumptive sentence of 2 to 4 years in state prison. The words state prison hung in the air between us, heavy and real. This was no longer a messy family dispute to be argued over pot roast. This was the law. This was the system. And for the first time in my life, that system was going to be my weapon, not my burden. The validation was a powerful, fortifying force. My pain wasn't just a feeling in my head anymore, it was a prosecutable offense. As General Patton said, Gregory remarked with a grim smile, a good plan, violently executed now, is better than a perfect plan next week. We dove into the work. The rest of the evening was a blur of focused energy. We drafted the legal documents, Gregory citing statutes and legal precedents while I provided the specific dates, times, and details of Tiffany's long campaign of theft. We crafted letters to the banks written in sharp, unforgiving legalese that left no room for interpretation. We composed the official police report, a cold, chronological narrative of the betrayal, stripped of all emotion. The next morning, I had a mission of my own to conduct, alone. I drove to the pawn shop on the east side of Denver, the crumpled notice from my mail tucked in my pocket. I walked into the dimly lit room, the air thick with the smell of dust, desperation, and old regrets. I paid the clerk the $100 Tiffany had gotten for my father's memory. He retrieved a small plastic bag from a back room and placed the dog tags in my hand. Feeling their familiar weight, the cool metal scored with the tiny scratches of a life well lived, I didn't feel the sting of grief anymore. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated strength. This sacred artifact was no longer a symbol of my loss. It was now a symbol of my war. I took a clear, detailed photo of the tags with my phone, the image sharp and undeniable. They would be Exhibit A in our dossier. Back at the apartment, Gregory reviewed our now complete file. There's one last step, he said, closing the binder. We give them one chance to surrender unconditionally. Before we file the report with the police, we confront them. Both of them. Together. I looked at him, a question in my eyes. He held up a hand. This isn't about mercy, Salma. It's about strategy. A cornered enemy is a predictable one. We need a confession. Or, at the very least, we need their guilty silence witnessed by an officer of the court, me. It will make your case legally airtight, undeniable. I understood. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. My hand was perfectly steady. When she answered, her voice was wary, cautious. My own voice was calm, detached, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a commander issuing an order. I am informing you that my lawyer and I will be at the house tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock to discuss the legal ramifications of Tiffany's actions. Ensure she is present. There was a sputtering protest on the other end, a frantic attempt to negotiate, but I spoke over her, my words cutting through her denial like steel. This is not a request. It was an order. The final battle had been scheduled. Promptly at 7 p.m., we arrived at the house in Arvada. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I had chosen my outfit with tactical precision. A sharp, dark, gray business suit, a crisp white shirt. My hair was pulled back in a severe, professional bun. This was the arrival of a new woman, not the dutiful daughter they thought they knew. Gregory was beside me, clad in a lawyer's armor, a perfectly tailored navy suit, his leather briefcase held firmly in his hand. That briefcase was our arsenal. We didn't enter as children returning home. We entered as officers of the court, agents of a consequence they had set in motion long ago. They were waiting for us on the living room sofa, exactly as I'd pictured. They looked small and anxious, dwarfed by the impending confrontation. The television was off, the silence in the room thick and heavy. There were no greetings, no hollow pleasantries. Gregory and I moved to the armchair opposite them, a deliberate move that framed the encounter as an interrogation. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table that separated us, the sound of the leather hitting the wood a dry, final thud. It established a clear, uncrossable border. "Thank you for seeing us," Gregory began, his voice calm, measured, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "We're here to discuss the resolution of Sergeant Porter's civil and criminal complaints against Ms. Tiffany Porter." I remained silent, letting him lead the charge. This was his battlefield. He unlatched the briefcase with 2 sharp clicks and retrieved the thick binder, our dossier of deceit. He placed it on the table on top of the briefcase. It was a physical manifestation of the truth. "For more than a year," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, "my client, Sergeant Salma Porter, has been the victim of a systematic campaign of identity fraud." He opened the binder. With the precision of a prosecutor presenting his case, he began to dismantle Tiffany's world, one piece of paper at a time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The facts were his weapon. Exhibit A, an American Express card opened 7 months ago. Current balance, $15,212, he said, sliding a copy of the statement across the table. Exhibit B, a Visa card from Bank of America, opened 5 months ago. Balance, $8,450. Another statement followed. Exhibit C, a personal loan from SoFi, taken out 3 months ago. Principal, $12,000. With each new charge, my mother flinched as if she were being physically struck. Tiffany just stared, her face growing paler. She tried to interrupt, a weak, stammering protest. That's not... I don't know anything about... The signature on each of these applications, Gregory cut her off smoothly, without even looking up from his papers, has been compared to the signature on your Colorado driver's license. They are a conclusive match. He slid a copy of the comparison report across the table. Checkmate. Tiffany began to unravel, her eyes darting frantically between the papers on the table and my unwavering, silent gaze. Seeing her panic, Gregory moved in for the final strike. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more serious, grave tone. "Ms. Porter," he said, addressing Tiffany directly. "These actions, totaling over $35,000, constitute identity theft, a Class 3 felony in the state of Colorado. The district attorney's office takes these cases very seriously, especially when the victim is an active duty member of the United States military." He paused, letting the full gravity of his words saturate the air in the small room. "We have the full complaint prepared," he continued, tapping the thick binder. "It is ready to be filed first thing tomorrow morning. The presumptive sentencing for this charge is 2 to 4 years in the state penitentiary." The word state penitentiary detonated in the center of the room like a bomb. The last of Tiffany's defiant bravado disintegrated. All that was left was raw, animal panic. Her head whipped around, her wild eyes landing on our mother. She was no longer a con artist. She was a terrified child looking for a mommy to fix her mess. "Mom!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly with desperation. "Mom, you have to do something. This is your fault. It's your fault for not giving me the money in the first place." And there it was, the confession. The petulant, blame-shifting, utterly selfish admission of guilt. It was the sound of a parasite turning on its host, and it was the blow that finally broke my mother. The carefully constructed wall of denial that she had lived behind for decades crumbled into dust. For the first time, she seemed to truly see her eldest daughter, not as the misunderstood victim, but as a cruel, manipulative stranger. A gasp escaped her lips, a sound of pure, soul-deep agony. Her face collapsed, and the tears that came were not the crocodile tears of a manipulator, but the heartbroken sobs of a woman whose world had just been obliterated. "Why, Tiffany?" she wept, her voice a shattered whisper. "Why would you do this to your sister?" It was over. My victory was absolute, and it tasted like ash in my mouth. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. I looked down not at my sister, but at my mother. "You have 24 hours to present us with a formal offer of full financial restitution," I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. "If we do not receive it, the complaint will be filed. My mission here is complete." Without another word, Gregory and I turned and walked out the door, leaving them alone in the wreckage they had built, one lie at a time. The drive back to Gregory's apartment was quiet. There was no sense of elation, no thrill of victory. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a profound and bone-deep exhaustion. It was the feeling a soldier gets after a long and brutal campaign, when the battle is finally over, and all that's left is the deafening silence. The war was won, but the cost was still being calculated. The next morning, the official surrender came. Gregory got a call from a harried-sounding lawyer my mother and Tiffany had scrambled to hire. There was no negotiation, no counteroffer. It was an unconditional capitulation. They accepted all of our terms. Tiffany would sign a legally binding promissory note acknowledging the full debt. She would agree to the liquidation of any assets she had, which weren't many, and a mandatory garnishment of her future wages until every stolen dollar was repaid. In exchange, I would agree not to file the criminal complaint, a single thread of mercy I was willing to extend, not for her, but for myself. My objective was never to see her behind bars. It was to terminate the parasitic relationship and force her to finally take responsibility for her own life. Justice, in my own way, had been served. A few days later, as the legal paperwork was being processed, my phone began to light up with a barrage of text messages from Tiffany. They were a pathetic, chaotic mess of self-pity, blame, and hollow, meaningless apologies. "You've ruined my life," one read. Another followed minutes later. "I said I was sorry, okay? Are you happy now?" I read them, but the words couldn't find purchase. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just a vast, empty distance. She still didn't get it. She never would. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. With the calm, detached precision of a soldier clearing a minefield, I opened her contact information. I blocked her number. I went onto my social media accounts and blocked her there too. I systematically severed every line of communication. It wasn't an act of hatred. It was an act of self-preservation. The war was over. I would no longer engage in pointless skirmishes. A week later, a letter arrived. It was a handwritten envelope, addressed to me in my mother's familiar, looping cursive. I sat with it in Gregory's quiet apartment for a long time, turning it over in my hands. Finally, I took a deep breath and opened it. The letter was filled with regret and anguish. She wrote that she had failed as a mother, that she had been blind and weak, that she had allowed her love for one child to curdle into a poison that harmed the other. I believed her words were sincere, that her pain was real. But then I read the final sentence, and I knew that nothing had fundamentally changed. "I hope that one day," she wrote, "you can find it in your heart to forgive your sister, and our family can be like it was before." That one line told me everything. She still didn't understand. There was no before to go back to. Before was the problem. Before was the disease. She wasn't mourning the loss of a healthy family. She was mourning the loss of a dysfunctional system in which she was comfortable. That night, I found my father's old Bible, the one I had taken from the house after he died. I opened it to a passage he had underlined so many times the ink had bled through the thin page. It was from the book of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." Reading those words, I understood what I had to do. Act justly. I had held Tiffany accountable for her actions. Love mercy. I had chosen restitution over prison, and now I had to walk humbly. to accept the truth of what my family was, not what I wished it to be, and to move on. I wrote a letter back to my mother. It was short, and it was kind. I told her I accepted her apology, but that I needed space, and I needed time. I made no promises about a future reunion. The only promise I made was to take care of myself. The final decision came to me with absolute clarity a few days later. The house in Arvada. It wasn't just a building. It was a monument to my pain, the stage for every act of my family's long-running tragedy. It was the last chain holding me to a past I needed to escape. Because my father's will had left it to both me and Tiffany, I had a legal right to force its sale. I called my mother and told her my decision. She cried, but she didn't protest. The fight had gone out of her. The sale was quick. After my mother took her share, the remaining equity was split. I took my half, and with a single cashier's check, I paid off every fraudulent debt Tiffany had incurred under my name. It was gone, all of it. The real estate agent handed me a check for what was left. I stood on the sidewalk, holding that piece of paper in my hand. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine, untouched, unclaimed. I had severed the final shackle. No more debt, no more obligations, no more entanglements. I was completely and utterly free. With the financial chains broken and my soul finally unshackled, I made the decision I had been dreaming of for years. I put in a request with the Army for a permanent change of station, a transfer to a unit near Portland, Oregon. I didn't just want a new apartment. I needed a new horizon, a new sky, a place where there were no ghosts waiting for me on familiar street corners. The orders came through. It wasn't an escape. In my mind, it was a strategic redeployment into a life of my own choosing. I packed my truck with the few belongings that truly mattered, leaving the rest behind. As I drove west on I-80, crossing the border out of Colorado, I watched the jagged, familiar peaks of the Rocky Mountains shrink in my rearview mirror until they were just a faint, blue line against the sky. I felt no sadness, no lingering sense of loss. All I felt was a quiet, profound gratitude. That brutal, ugly war I had fought in the shadow of those mountains, the war that had nearly destroyed me, had also forged me into someone new. It had given me the most precious gift of all, myself. Life in Portland was a revelation. It was the clean, damp smell of pine and rain in the air, the lush, overwhelming green of the trees, the soft gray light that seemed to encourage introspection. But most importantly, it was the gift of anonymity. Here, I wasn't Salma, the problem solver. I wasn't Salma, the family ATM. I was just Salma, a sergeant in the U.S. Army, a woman who enjoyed hiking on the weekends and finding the best cup of coffee in the city. I was a blank slate, but a soldier is defined by her mission. Without one, there is a void. To find that sense of purpose again, a purpose that was truly my own, I signed up to volunteer with Team Rubicon. It was everything I needed. On weekends, I would put on the organization's gray t-shirt and join teams of other veterans, deploying to small towns in Oregon and Washington that had been ravaged by wildfires. We weren't armed with rifles. We were armed with chainsaws, shovels, and sledgehammers. We helped families sift through the ashes of their homes, looking for wedding rings and photo albums. We cleared away blackened, fallen trees to make way for new growth. Out there, covered in soot and sweat, working alongside men and women who understood the language of service, I found the meaning of my own story. We weren't a collection of broken soldiers. We were a highly skilled, disciplined unit, turning our past experiences with destruction into a powerful force for healing and rebuilding. We were bringing order to the chaos, not with violence, but with our own two hands. I was serving again, but this time, the mission was creation. 6 months after I moved, I got a call from Gregory. "So, funny thing," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "My firm has a branch office in Portland, and it turns out they have an opening for a lawyer specializing in veterans affairs." He moved 2 months later. Our friendship, the one that had been forged in the crucible of my personal war, slowly and naturally blossomed into something deeper, something quieter and more profound. We spent our weekends exploring the city. We walked for hours along the green banks of the Willamette River, the water flowing steadily out to sea, talking about everything and nothing. He never tried to fix me. He never treated me like I was fragile. He simply walked beside me, a solid, dependable presence, his quiet strength a mirror of my own. He had seen me at my absolute worst, in the depths of my rage and despair, and he hadn't flinched. He had just offered me a clean t-shirt and a cup of tea. He was living proof that the family you choose, the one built on a foundation of mutual respect and unwavering trust, is the only one that truly matters. One quiet evening, I was sitting on the small balcony of my new apartment, looking out at the glittering lights of the city spread out below me. I had a new, clean journal open on my lap. I wasn't writing damage reports anymore. I was writing down the lessons I had learned. On the very first page, I wrote out my new philosophy, a new set of rules of engagement for the rest of my life. Your highest loyalty, I wrote, is not to the unit you were born into, but to the principles that allow you to survive with honor. Sometimes the most courageous act a soldier can perform is not to fight to the bitter end. It's to execute a strategic retreat in order to win the larger war, the war for your own peace. I closed the journal and looked out at the city, at the life I had built for myself. I had found it. Peace. Mission accomplished. My war on the home front is over, but I know many of you might still be in the middle of your own quiet battles or just beginning to heal from them. The battlefield might be different. A difficult phone call, a holiday dinner, an unfair decision. But the fight for your own peace is the most important mission you will ever have. If my story resonated with you, I want you to know that you are not alone, and your peace is worth fighting for. In the comments below, please share one small step you've taken this week to reclaim your own peace. It could be as simple as saying no or taking a walk by yourself. Your stories give me strength. Thank you for listening. If you want to join our community and hear more stories about finding strength in adversity, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. You are part of this unit now.